Thanks, Manila and John, for two fantastic presentations already today. I really enjoyed them, and I'm heartened to think that this presentation here dovetails to a certain extent with both of those, in the sense that we're going to be talking about social media and digital ethnography, and what I mean by that slightly arcane title is really what do we do to move more towards a qual approach, or a more holistic approach to social research. And the device we're going to use to talk about that is a project that we did here at Conversian a little while back. The questions of which were a little bit distinct, or a little bit anomalous in terms of the type of thing that we had previously been asked. So the questions that our client came to us with were much more kind of, first of all, very targeted, less measurement focused, and much more qualitative in nature, and they were as follows. First of all, they wanted to understand what beauty meant to members of Generation Y, and how people discussed and behaved around the issue of beauty and grooming. Secondly, they wanted to think about gender and what the effect of gender was on beauty and grooming practices. Thirdly, this was a multi-country project, multi-geography project, so we were looking at differences between countries and cultures in terms of the way that Generation Y discusses and expresses themselves rather, in terms of beauty and grooming. And then finally, look at ways in which social media is impacting practices and purchases around beauty and grooming. So a relatively, a very interesting but a relatively new type of question for a social research provider to answer. So the first question was really, how do we go about this? You know, a lot of social media work is quant focused, and I think Manila captured it very well in the first part of her presentation when she talked about measurement. So a lot of social media, measurement actually kind of masquerades as research to a certain extent, and I think there's a distinction to be made. So the brand-centric kind of measurement stuff is focused on where is the discussion taking place. And don't get me wrong, these are all laudable objectives, but I think it's useful for us to all understand the distinction here. So understanding where conversation is taking place, what does sentiment look like, and potentially also emotion too. Who's talking about the brand, and what's the volume of conversation. A lot of these are kind of performance measurement type of exercise. On the other side of things, however, we look at culture-centric, so potentially category level, but specifically culture-centric kind of questions. So what sort of communities are emerging around a category? What do these communities talk and care about? How do people think and talk about a particular category? And then what products and brands is a community promoting through word of mouth? And that's a kind of distinct set of questions from the brand set. And the idea of this presentation is to walk you through some ways in which you can combine these types or answers to these types of research questions to come out with a more holistic and perhaps integrated view of a particular issue. So in terms of the approaches that can be used, another way of viewing that distinction, that dichotomy there, is to think about it in terms of a quant approach versus a qual approach, or potentially even an automated versus a human-driven approach. So on one end of the spectrum, you have the automation of looking at counting the number of messages around a particular issue, figuring out where the conversation is taking place, who the authors are, maybe ascribing to them some kind of influence score, and then potentially looking at sentiment in that conversation. And a lot of that you can do via automation, via button pushing effectively. On the other end of things, however, you're looking at how people talk. You're looking to find trends and things that are cool out there, looking at controversies and gender and cultural difference and behavior. That's a distinct exercise, a very different type of research exercise. So you can consider social research as all existing on all types of research as existing on that kind of continuum. But I think it's interesting now to see that social research is becoming to be perceived as measurable in that way too. So what was the methodology we used to answer these questions? First of all, relatively straightforward. We assemble a list of keywords to pull in relevant content around the beauty and grooming category. We looked at messages. I think it was a 2-month period we looked at, and then within of the messages that came back during that period, we tagged them for gender, for consumer segment, for topics, and for sentiment, and a few other metrics that you'll see in the rest of this presentation. So then the analysts, looked at the tag data, and then finally, and very importantly, we supplemented a lot of the quote-unquote conversation analysis with effectively behavioral analysis using YouTube. So it's seeing how people are actually documenting their lives in the context of beauty and grooming. So the advantage of this kind of approach was, people, obviously we get asked here at Conversing, what are the advantages of social research? And I dare say a lot of people on the phone get asked the same question. And the two things that spring to my mind are, first of all, is the fact that it's unprompted. John alluded to that in his presentation also. And then secondly, there's a potential efficiency in terms of fielding, in the sense that the data is already out there. It's just a question of finding and collating, as distinct from having to field anew. So that gives us a lot of flexibility in terms of making this efficient from a geographic scope perspective. So we looked across China, India, Mexico, the UK, and the US, and in three languages: Chinese, English, and Spanish. So in terms of the type of analysis we did, the first type was leaning much more towards the quant or automation end of the spectrum. So we're looking at venue analysis, understanding which types of websites people are discussing the beauty and grooming category on. And that's really something that can be done. I mean, that is a button push. You collect a bunch of data, and you literally sort or do a count by effectively do a count by what the type of venue is, whether that's Twitter or whether it's blogs or whether it's forums. It's as automatable as automation can be effectively in our world here. Now, in terms of what the actual results were, you could, there are interesting distinctions between countries here. So you can see, for example, that the blogs are very, very prominent in India. Twitter, I think, probably a little bit relatively could be foreseeable, was prominent in the US, but the key one for me there is the blogs in India, and we'll see that in terms of the implications of this finding here. So, the intelligence about finding out where the conversation is taking place can first of all inform ad spending. So you can target the venues where people are talking about the product category. So maybe the prominence of forums in all countries means that that's a good. That would be a potential venue for banner ads. For India, however, where blogs are really key, potentially influencer outreach might be a useful avenue to pursue. So it can inform your ad strategy and also your engagement strategy too. And then moving on in terms of metric, we also looked at gender. That was one of the questions we had at the outset. What are the differences between genders here? And gender is kind of halfway in terms of automation between fully automatable and not fully automatable, in the sense that you can get a lot of it from Twitter profile data, but yeah, not everyone fills out their profile data correctly. Sometimes you have to supplement it, so it's kind of in between. It's not rocket science by any means, and it's not particularly. Obviously, it's a two-part label here, so it's not particularly nuanced either. So it's not a subtle piece of analysis, but nevertheless, it's not necessarily susceptible to 100% to automation. So what do we find when we looked at that? So we can see that women are much more active in social media around the category in general, but men are frequently turning to social to discuss shaving and oral care. So in terms of the implications, again, it can help you target your marketing and advertising strategy. So you can see that the men are turning to social to discuss shaving and oral care. Maybe that's an opportunity. Maybe that's an angle which you could use to connect to the male segment here. And there's obviously the other side of that coin also, which is that marketing via social for hair and skincare products, say, may be less effective in terms of the male demographic. Then another interesting piece of analysis we did was to look at life events, and I've heard this called a bunch of things. I think some people actually call it. Some people have actually called it consumer intent too. But semantics aside, what we were doing was analyzing the. Hold on 2 seconds, my screen's going to update. We were analyzing the type of events that people were discussing in the context of beauty and grooming. So we can see here, for example, that in India, a lot of the beauty and grooming conversation was focused on vacations and weddings. So you see big differences between the countries here, which are really interesting. So, what can you do with that data? So, it can help you understand what triggers planned purchases for particular groups and what the associations are that the consumers have between events and products in any given category. So you can, it might affect your creative content, the actual content itself. Maybe you're going to be focusing more on vacations and wedding type stuff in India, for example. And then from a timing perspective, it may, that may well affect your strategy here as well. So if vacation conversation is driving a lot of conversation about your category, then maybe you might want to time it. Then on the far end of the spectrum here, we're looking at what we've called here ethnographic analysis, and this is the much more nuanced kind of subtle stuff, and it involves, it's not just a measurement exercise, it's much more akin to qual research. So in this category here, what we found was a lot of people talking about these things that I'm sure many people on the webinar here are familiar with, the concept of hauls. So that was really interesting to our client to see that there was such a great degree of activity on YouTube here, where people document their purchases and freebies and all that kind of stuff and do reviews basically online of a lot of cosmetic stuff. And this is, it's very, very significant content from the engagement perspective. So 50,000 views of this particular video, 1,000 comments. A lot of trust is put in the person making the review here. And it's not just limited to YouTube. This is also, there are also hauls which are documented on blogs, and you can see people start to talk about the ways in which the person talking about the products in this blog had actually made them revisit some of their product choices and potentially even buy some of these products too. So, what can a marketer do with that information? With this kind of not just hauls, but looking at the behavior around a particular category. Well, first of all, it's great for cool hunting. Understanding, in this particular instance, we were talking about Generation Y, millennials, so it was great from the perspective of understanding what they were getting excited about, which products they disliked, before it's largely perceptible what a particular preference might be. And then aside from cool hunting, there's also the potential for this type of analysis to uncover and discover novel product uses, so things you didn't really expect your products to be used for. And there's another way in which the ethnographic approach here can be useful. It's finding out particular characteristics of particular geographical markets. So we saw, for example, in India and China, a lot of conversation, a lot of social media messages along the lines of the ones on the left-hand side of the screen here. So a lot of comments around using natural treatments here for acne. And the advantage here for the marketer is to understand what the differences are between various markets in terms of which might inform advertising imagery and messaging. So knowing that what we do now about the Chinese and Indian markets in terms of the natural remedies and so on, that might affect that might rather inform a different kind of type of marketing strategy that might be prevalent here in the US for that particular brand. And then to blow out some of the analysis we were talking about earlier on, I described it as life events, so looking at vacations and weddings. If you use an ethnographic approach here, you can also blow that out and bring it to life a little bit, so you can see that people are talking about weddings, for example, and what does that actually look like in real life, And that's what the blowing this out looks like, and that can help you understand what type of content resonates with your target audience. You can see here a lot of people are very, very engaged with content, which is addressing the issue of advice and suggestions around that fashion. So, it can help you to identify new opportunities to engage with your customer base or your prospective customer base. And then, again, blowing out the issue we saw earlier on about, how males were using social or discussing the beauty and grooming category in social. You can also blow that out using the ethnographic analysis here. So you can see that men are responding very positively to a lot of bloggers and video bloggers talking about potentially touchy subjects like eyebrow plucking and waxing. Again, very serious numbers in terms of engagement with the people who are doing this kind of stuff. So this guy here had 10,000 subscribers. What can a marketer do with that information? The main thing here is uncovering consumer wants and needs that are not being met in the current markets. The critical one here is once you put connecting the dots, once you discover that there's a lot of conversation among males around shaving and oral care, what is that conversation about? What this told us was that there's a huge lack of information about male grooming, and particularly about potentially embarrassing or touchy subjects too. So that's a real learning for the marketer here. And then another dimension in which ethnographic analysis can be useful, and along the lines of the one we mentioned a few slides back, is looking at particular differences between cultures. And one issue we had here was talking about skin whitening creams and how this is a controversial issue in the Indian market. So the learning here for the marketer is that it gives them an idea as to which issues are potentially controversial, divisive, and help to inform marketing that might otherwise have been taking some missteps. So in this particular example, that advertising for whitening creams is likely to alienate or potentially offend a certain segment of consumers, and at a higher level, it's worth knowing that certain types of which types of campaign are likely to work in which types of geography and culture. What works in one is not necessarily going to work in another one. So to conclude, basically, the idea for us, alongside answering the questions that we had at the beginning of the deck here, was to use an approach which leveraged both some of the quantitative and sort of measurement-focused type of things that might typically be done by social research, but also to round it out with some more interesting behavioral stuff. And I think the two things together gave the client in this particular instance a very nice understanding of the category, which was not just measurement focused and wasn't just qual. It was a very good mixture of the two, and they complement each other. They complement each other really well.